Oh, okay. But I think the important thing is that despite me Googling it, I actually had no idea of what it meant. I knew it meant come down spirits, but it's really interesting how the wrong words get used again and again and again as if they were real. And, you know, the original context is lost. So I'm going to take a page out of Chachamba's dad's book, and I will just ask. So let's have a look at what we are up to today. There's Simon. So we thought we'd just start off with a little bit of a breakaway because we like breakaways. Our aim with our community is for people to meet each other, not only communicate through us. So we would like to know, why are you here today? And we're going to send you off into groups of about 3 people just to find out exactly why you are here today. What is it that you want to learn? What is it that interests you? Are you okay with that? 30 people, so we'll have 10 groups. Okay, and you're being assigned automatically, and see you later. Bye. Solo.
And Margarita, yeah.
No.
Did you guys get breakout room notifications?
No, they haven't got. Alistair B should be having Lerato, so I'm just going to move. I'm going to move Andrea to. Oh, no, Pete and Alistair have got each other. That's okay. That's okay. No.
Oh,
Pete.
some people are falling back in.
Help. I'm going to join the break.
Okay, send me off as well, please. Julia. How do I go back to my breakout? Oh.
Ndumiso.
Julia, how are you? Let me put my camera on.
Yeah, I want to see you.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you want me to send you off somewhere?
You know, I'm really being a supportive husband. I think my literature at this point today is to observe and receive. I found myself in a room. Yeah.
Okay, so you'll just sit there amongst the strelitzia, looking very South African. There's the national flower behind you.
Yeah.
And smile with great pride.
Will do, exactly, will do.
That's beautiful. And where did she disappear to?
So she was asking you to send her to another room, and I can hear her talking, so I think she was sent to room 4, potentially.
Oh, I also went to room 4, but then I came back.
Okay.
Whatever. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
God, it's divine to finally meet you. What do you do? Are you in this sort of field too? Ooh.
Well, to some degree, I'm a film director. So I guess when I say, I direct film and television and documentaries, and that's my calling in life. So I think how I weave my stories is very much in line with, I guess, how I think Agambo weaving enneagram in people's life, except I seem to lean on the id, the ego, and different archetypes of just suggesting characters.
Can't you do us a movie on Biko and the inner journey?
We could definitely do something interesting like that. Kukard has been talking about those things. We could definitely do something like that because I think it's a journey I would want to travel.
Me too. I need that man's help. And I don't know if you've seen that movie. Judas's Lament, the Lament of Judas.
No, I have not seen it. Let me write that down. The Lament of Judas.
So it's Battalion 32. Are you too young to know what that was?
Well, it was the 32 battalion that fought the border wars, formidable on the continent.
That's it.
Yes.
So they became incredibly abused people because they'd raped, they were child soldiers, so they live in little camps in, I can't remember the name of it now, in the Free State somewhere. So a filmmaker, I don't know if you know Makgati, who's part of our group. She's also known as Pilgrim in Heels, and she makes movies, and it was a connection of hers that made the movie.
Okay.
But there were a lot of themes in that movie that about redemption, because about redemption for me as a white person. So, I mean, like that's a really, it's a good, if you're a movie maker, you should watch it, but be prepared to cry.
Okay. Now I'll definitely watch it. I haven't had a good cry in a film in a while.
It's like, how do people live with that level of shame? And I think, so Biko asked that question as well, like, where's the pride? How do we live when the world hates us?
I'm going to get the film today. I'll check it out.
I can't remember where it's off an international website. It's for free, I think. It used to be. Sharon Farr was the filmmaker, I think.
Sharon Farr, I think I used to work with her brother. She used to own a company called Spirit Sundays, and she used to make these. Yeah. Yes, Sharon Farr. Okay.
I think Sharon might have been involved in that, or I don't know, or one of her friends, but Makgati gave me the movie. It's shocking South African. But I'd love to make a movie. And all my family work in the movie industry, or lots do.
Okay. And how come you didn't get into the film industry?
Oh, I'm far too clever. No, I don't have enough attention to detail to be a producer. And all that standing around that you lot do is just like dreadfully boring. My brother-in-law's a steady cam operator.
What's his name?
Adi Visser.
Adi Visser. Okay. I guess I know the people around you.
Do you know them?
Interesting. I know them by name. So quite often, there aren't many steady cam operators, and good ones anyway. So there's like a handful of names that we reference for each other. There's Steady Joe, Steady Mike, Adi Visser. There's different people.
Oh, Sweetman. Steady Joe, Steady Mike, Steady Adi. And my sister's wardrobe, two of them. Kathy Kukard.
Okay. I can't say.
More Cape Town, and more local. No,
Okay, no, I'm actually signed to a Cape Town-based company. I'm going tomorrow for a commercial, but I'll definitely keep my ear out.
Yeah, do. Which company are you going to?
So for television commercials, I directed a company called 7 Films. They're based in Cape Town. They're called 7 Films. And outside of that, I make my own movies. So I'm signed to myself, Jounder Media. We do everything in-house. Gagambo actually executive produces for us.
You see, I would love to talk more about that, but I feel like I'm getting sucked into this conversation and forgetting.
Sure thing.
So I'm coming back to you, Ndumiso, and I'm going to find Chachamba in the ether.
Yeah.
Okay, 2 more minutes. I don't know where she's gone. Tell her to come back to the real world.
Okay, you just wrote a message, 2 more minutes. I'm actually not sure how Zoom all works. You send people into rooms. This is fascinating.
I know.
I found myself in a room with one other person. You sent me just now to a room, and I was like, okay.
Oh.
So I came back.
Yeah, good. At least you knew how to come and find your way back. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Okay, so I've said them 2 minutes, and so I'm going to close all rooms.
So what are they doing in the rooms? Are they discussing themes? Okay, very cool.
Because you get better quality conversation if it's smaller rooms, and then they build their relationship with each other, not me.
Understood.
Yeah. Lorata Tsolo's come back, and now I'm going to close all rooms. And they've been given 60 seconds to finish up. I don't know where Lorata's. No.
Sorry, Julia.
It's fine. At least you're alive behind that screen.
Technology played tricks on me.
Well, you can just chip in as you want to from now onwards.
Thank you.
Everyone should be back very soon. Here they come. Such is the life of the Wi-Fi. I should have been having load shedding, but somehow I haven't. Hello. I'm pleased to say load shedding didn't come as expected. So I brought all my candles so I wouldn't have to sit here like the Addams family, but it looks like all is well. So great. Anybody want to let us know why they're here? Tembi, I haven't seen you for so long. You have to start.
Please do tell me to share my story in our group. I was actually also going to point you out.
Okay, evening everyone. So I think the reason why I'm here, firstly, I know Julia, you always conducted these sessions and you facilitated the session, but primarily is that Jajambo was going to be the facilitator, which I was looking forward to hearing her voice, and also the topic. But as we were sharing in our chat room, I said, you know, if I can free associate what we spoke about is the movie the series that I watched recently about the South African Tusombedu, South African features on the series as the main character. So I watched it just to see what is the movie all about, but to realize that it was about slavery in America. And looking at that, I started asking myself questions about race, being Black, and also what does it mean, spirituality, God, is God for us, is God for Black people? If God is for Black people as well, why do Black people go through what they've gone through and still go through what they go through? So, and I think the inner part of that and Biko, I think that drew me to this conversation, and I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you. Beautiful. Beautiful. Be interesting to see how different people from different races comment differently on this. Let's hear, I mean, if they do comment differently. Who else wants to make a comment?
Only that's probably why I'm here, is that, as I said before, I've had a conversation about Biko on a number of occasions, and they're always unbelievably different and take totally different courses and trajectories sometimes. And that's all about the people, of course, who are having the conversation. So that's why I'm here, is to see how it manifests again, totally differently. And how people engaged with it so differently, and him so differently.
Yeah. Beautiful. More comments.
I got up early here in the US. No, at 6 a.m. to get up at 7 something. It's all good. Because that concept of inner freedom, I want some of that. I was drawn to the aspiration of having some within me. And I see so many people within my field. I teach teachers and school administrators where they feel so subject to things. They don't feel that they have an inner freedom in many ways. And I know too little about Stephen Biko. I've seen a movie. And so what I could learn about it and I know you from the Growth Edge Network, Julia. So I'm here.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else like to add? Alistair, hello.
Hi, Julia, and hi to everybody on the call. So my reasons for being here is that I've recently moved into the diversity and inclusion space, and I feel that the element of healing is often omitted in workshops. It's always about us versus them. You said this, you said that. So I think the Biko's work is, I don't know much about it, but I just have this gut feel that it can be used in healing people who've been impacted by the history of what happened in this country. And I don't know if I mentioned that I was born in Zimbabwe, but I moved here to study. So he's like a South African hero that I don't know much about. The media gave us a lot of Mandela. We know a lot about Mandela. But when I moved here, we knew a lot about Mandela and Shaka Zulu, but guys like Biko were not often advertised, so to speak. So I'm just here as a student, and I'm sure I'm in safe hands and hoping to learn. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for your confidence. Any other comments? It's very interesting. Yeah, sorry, who was that? Penny.
I'm sorry, that was me.
Hi.
Yeah, there's so many reasons for me to come. I mean, I'm just curious about Biko and this concept of inner freedom, but I've also been committed to being a co-conspirator and to do what I can to open up space for people of color, and especially Black Americans, which is in this country different than other people of color. And I teach, and I'm starting to open up those spaces for students to have discussions. And so I just want to learn more about being a better co-conspirator.
Thank you. Beautiful. Beautiful. What I always find so fascinating is how many different points of access Biko's work has. So, I mean, we're going to talk about this shortly, but for Black people, for understanding Blackness, for white people, for understanding Blackness, whiteness, and inner freedom, for understanding what oppression is. There's just so many things that Biko does in his work, and that's why it's always such a joy to work with him. Chachambo, do you want to say anything? You cool?
Yeah, no, I think what you pointed out was what I was thinking, that depending on your position, you know, Biko meets you differently. And that's, yeah, and I think Biko is so for our time, especially Penny, when you bring in, you know, Black Lives Matter, you look at what's happening in the States, you see it all over the world. Biko's work is really for this time. So yeah, welcome to everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So, yeah, Chachambo and I thought we would share a little bit about us and why we like this work, and what are some of the difficulties with working with Biko, both as a Black person and as a white person. Do you want to start?
Yeah, and I think, the first place we started, and which we spoke about at length, is the first thing is we have to put our own Blackness and our own whiteness on the table, and what does that mean? Because Biko is unafraid to look through those lenses, and that's the conversation we're here to have. So you asked maybe just a bit about my own background. Biko, I was reflecting back on when did I first meet him or meet his work, and Biko's work I really first met in high school. And I remember when I was in high school, I took history thinking, I'm so excited, I can't wait to get to South African history, and quite specifically Biko. Biko is very alive in my home. My dad's a big supporter of many African concepts, so Biko was very alive, Sobukwe was very alive, Krisani was very alive, but I'd never read anything or studied anything. And what struck me about the schooling experience, which is still true in this country, is that we ended up spending 1 week on Biko, Sasso, Black Consciousness, Black People's Convention in a rushed matric year experience. Whereas I distinctly remember in grade 3, spending 2 to 3 months on Vasco da Gama, on Bartholomew Dias, on those stories, and that never left me. And it's still like that today, that our own history of complexity in our country is shunned to, you must select history and you get 2-3 days of it. Whereas other histories, which are less complex, are given lots of time and different contexts. Even in grade 3, the conversation wasn't about colonization. It was more about the beginning of South Africa, which we'll get into. So that's where I met Biko, and that's my background with Biko, and why I love this work for me is that Biko's been very personal to giving me my own frameworks to my own inner freedom. I was sharing in our small group that really coming out with the questions, and a lot of the questions that Utembi was raising, the root of it being, what is it about being Black? What is this experience that I'm having? Biko's work gave me the tools to investigate how I got here, but it also gave me the tools to throw forward for myself, for my families, for my people, for my community, for my country. So that's really why I love Biko's work. And coming to Blackness, I think we're very conscious, especially as a Black and white team or ebony and ivory team, is that I don't want to just bring all the Blackness to the table, because that's another way we can self-oppress. And how do we bring ourselves fully, being Black, but being a lot of other things as well, to this conversation.
Welcome to workout number 4.
Julia, do you want to go for it?
Workout. Maybe that's where I should be. So I've always loved Biko. Should we ask that person to stop their exercise or not? No. Okay, so I've always loved Biko, and as a white person, when I first heard about Biko, I went like, oh, why can't I be part of the struggle? And I felt quite offended by that. But as I got to know his work and understand exactly what he meant by Black man, you're on your own, and by his comments that were so disparaging about white liberals, of which I am one, I started to really respect and understand his writing. And so my first kind of experience of him was like as an activist, as a revolutionary. But then I started reading his stuff and I saw that actually he was offering me a pathway out of my own shame. He was offering me a way to reconstruct my inner world in a way that was worthy of dignity and created agility in the world. So he gave me some really specific technologies on how to get over my childhood and how to get over a version of myself. Now, this is all quite a tricky kind of conversation, and Chachamba and I have had a lot of conversations about this. Am I just doing a bit of white appropriation? Have I stolen Biko's work and wedged it into my little white world? And so we thought we'd have an open conversation about this to kind of check it out. So what do you think, Chachamba? Is it cultural appropriation?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you and I, we've discussed many things, and even looking at privilege. You know, how do we work with privilege and bring the privilege of whiteness into the table? And cultural appropriation is interesting, and I think especially in this particular context, what I love about the approach is that it's Biko's approach. You know, no one's taking Biko's approach and making it their own. But where the appropriation changes to appreciation is when you're also able to use it to introspect. You know, so appropriation is more, in this context, appropriation can be if it's, you know, looking at them. Oh, Biko's giving me a way to look at them. But the appreciation is when we understand Biko's giving us a way to look at me and you, me. It's turned around. And that, I think, infuses it with something different and honest, you know. So yeah, and I think the other thing we discussed was also this idea of inner freedom versus outer freedom, which Biko speaks about both concepts in his writing. Is this the inner freedom, and the work is for Blacks and whites, you know, and Biko's very clear about that, and the outer freedom as well, and the work is also for Black and white people. And I know here today we're really focusing on this inner journey, which Biko also said, that's the path. The path even to the outer freedom is this inner journey, but both of twins, you know, they're like Gemini twins in their thinking. What do you think of inner versus outer, Julia? And let's open it up as well. Please interrupt, put up hands, pop in the chat box.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting because I, you know, coming from a psychological background, I'm obviously going to go the inner route for sure. And in South Africa, there's a lot of political parties who've spliced the inner work out of Biko's work. So they're only selling him on the basis of outer freedom. And I see again and again and again how if you only have outer freedom, and I'm speaking not just for Black people, I'm speaking for myself. If I'm freed from some of the shameful aspects of my history, even if the context changes, I'm still so tempted to repeat the behavior. So I don't think you can splice things. You can't separate out an inner freedom. You can create outer freedom, you can change the context, but unless the inner world has changed, it's not sustainable. That's my experience. And that's why I love Biko, as most liberation theorists forget about that part. Okie dokie. Can I move us on?
Yeah, I'm trying to look up if there's any hands or anything, but I think we're...
I can't see, I've got a... Yeah.
So we'll trust you guys to interrupt.
We're going to just talk through these various aspects of Biko's work. If you want us to stop, we'll spend more time on some areas. If you want us to continue, you know, we'll move through quite quickly. But we sort of thinking about this, we're pitching it at coaches and psychotherapists and more fully kind of around the inner freedom idea. And I suppose philosophers too, and people that work in diversity and inclusion. So that's how we'll go. But I think it also really works incredibly well for people who are changing their identity, who've moved out of a context and who need to remake themselves to fit this new part of their life. So we'll pitch at them too. And our objectives, we just want to help you love Biko as much as we love Biko. We want to get you talking in a straightforward way about Black and white. And we want to help people stop being politically correct, help them make some public blitzes and find ways to get over it and get to the nub of the issue if such a thing exists. We don't think race can be solved in a 2-hour session. And I want to talk about Biko for white people because that's the bit I know. And Chachamba is going to talk about Biko for Black people. And sometimes we're going to cross. So
Cool. So let's kick off with a brief history about the man and his life. And, Biko was only with us for 30 years. So he was really, really young when he died. But more importantly, I think when you think of that context, you realize how much he did in such a short time. So Biko was born in Takastad, which is a small little town in the Eastern Cape on the 18th of December, 1946. I also come from the Eastern Cape, so I feel closer to him, and so does Julia. Actually, in fact, Julia comes from closer. She's from King, from Konge. So she's really, a neighbor of the Bikos in many ways. He was raised in a Xhosa family in Ginsberg. So Ginsberg is the township for King Williamstown, which is also known as, what Xhosa name is Ikonge. And he comes from an Anglican family, and that Anglican influence, a big, strong part of it was his mom. His mom was really grounded within the Anglican church. And he was the third of 4 children. And early on in his life, when he was just 4 years old, Biko's dad passed away.
Sorry.
No worries. His dad passed away. His name was Umzingaye. His dad passed away, and this left his mom, Umamcete Biko, as the sole breadwinner. And Umamcete was working as a domestic worker and as well as a cook at a nearby hospital to raise these 4 children on her own. And what's so interesting with his mom being a domestic worker is that experience in his own home. In his later years, Biko really had a heart for the plight of domestic workers when you're looking at unions and just how people are treated within these spaces of employment. And that directly links back to his own mom. So Biko grew up, and then kind of early high school years, he was sent to a prestigious missionary school in the Eastern Cape. It's one of 2 highly prestigious schools back then called Lovedale College. And the second one was called Hill Down, which was in Fort Beaufort. And when he was 16, at this time, Biko wasn't politically aware. He wasn't very involved in politics. He was just a young guy, going to school, very smart, already showing up as very bright at school. But when he was 16 at Lovedale, his brother, who had been the head of Ukaya, was arrested. So his older brother. And Ukaya was very involved in the PAC and setting up the PAC kind of movement within the community. And he was arrested this day because they suspected he was involved in Poko. And Poko is the armed wing of the PAC. And when they arrested Ukaya, they also arrested Biko. And they questioned Biko. And after that, Biko was awakened. Ukaya is quoted in places of saying, in a way, he's really grateful to the South African police because they managed to do in one day what he couldn't do for years. And after that, the giant was awakened. So that was Biko's entrance into it. And because of his brother being expelled, he then also got expelled from Lovedale. And then he made his way into Marion Hill, which was a school in Durban, where he finished off his university. 1996, while still in Durban, he then began studying at UKZN. And this is when he started his career or studying as a medical doctor. Whilst he was at UKZN early on, in first year, Biko was in SRC. He was very involved with the NUSAS. He joined the NUSAS community. And the activist was alive. And it was something he was awakened to and could never drop from there. So we joined NUSAS, and there's something very distinct that happened, I think his second NUSAS conference, which was in Rhodes. Because NUSAS was a students' organization, but had white students, Black students, Indian students. And Biko began to feel that, these organizations, because Black people are undernumbered in these universities, the universities were predominantly white, the Black issues were not brought into the fore with NUSAS. And at this one particular conference in Rhodes, the conference is at play. Then the issue comes up of where the Black students are gonna spend the night. And the Black students stand up and say, guys, are we not against separation? Are we not saying we're against what the current government of the time is doing? And what they then found was they had no support for that part. And even though we're all in the conference together, we all say that we're against separate development. When it came to bedtime, the Black children or the Black students were sent to sleep over at a church in the nearby township. And they couldn't stay on the residence. They couldn't stay within the Rhodes space. And that's when Biko knew that we need something separate. We need something different. And together with other prominent people, the Bani Pichanas of the world, they set up SASO. So SASO is the South African Students Association, and it was very deliberately targeted at Black students, and Black being Black African, colored, and Indian students. Anyone who's having a Black life experience, you know. And with SASOs, this is where he developed, again, as a team, Black consciousness. And Black consciousness became the official ideology of SASO as an organization. This idea of inner and outer freedom, you know, really this rooted this organization. And also in that time, they developed Black community programs. So this is the way Biko and the team really externalized what is outer freedom, you know, and Black community programs with them changing things for themselves. There's a famous quote by Black consciousness that says, "Black man, you're on your own." And so Black community programs are almost the answer to that. What when you realize you're on your own? And they set up clinics, they set up education funds, they set up sports centers. When you go past the Kongwe, there's still it's a very dilapidated building, but there's a sports center that's called the Stephen Bantu Biko Sports Center today. I saw it last year. So there's still signs of these particular projects and programs that he put in place within King. And then while he was also there, he was writing under the pseudonym of Frank Talk. And that's where, if you've read his book, I Write What I Like, a lot of his speeches and work from that time is in that book. And that's where, again, he's working with the inner freedom. You know, he's developing a lot of these theories and he's really thinking about application of them in this world. So then 1972, he was also involved in the setting up of the Black People's Convention. What was so interesting about this time is that the liberation movement was really beginning to get wind within the south of Africa. Frelimo was building force in Mozambique. The independence of Mozambique was on the brink, everyone could feel it. There was a Frelimo support march set up in Northwest, and this is where Black People's Convention came to be as a space to celebrate and really ignite and use that same energy that was building in neighboring countries within South Africa. So he was instrumental in setting that up. And then 73, he is then banned. Biko's then banned from all political action, and he is banned back to King Williamstown. So he leaves Durban and he goes back to his hometown, the small little village of Ginsburg. But in this time, he doesn't stop. You know, he's still very politically active, and he ends up being detained on a number of occasions. What's interesting, between 73 and 77, my father has a story. I think it was 75. So my dad was a second year student at Fort Hare, and Biko's 9 years his senior. And he distinctly remembers being at a Black consciousness talk, and Biko was on stage. And remember, this is the time where he's detained. He's just supposed to be in his yard, nowhere else. And he was just telling me about, you know, how strategic Biko was, how Biko always was ahead of the boss. So boss is the Bureau of State Security. And they were always hunting him down. And at this talk, Biko's on stage, you know, sharing his thoughts. And then suddenly he just says to the crowd, you know, I'll be back. Give me 1 second. I just need to quickly pass some water in the bathroom. And someone else gets on stage, and a couple of hours later, everyone realizes, oh, Biko's gone, you know? And so that's how smart he had to be. And he was always evading the boss, and they were always looking for him. And there was so much distrust as well. I mean, there were informers within Fort Hare, there were informers within spaces of trust. So he really had to outsmart and play very smart, and he remained politically active. And he developed Black community projects within King Williamstown. Like I told you, there's even that sports center, which he put together while he was there. So that's 1973. And then 1977 was the year of Biko's death on the 12th of September. You know, so he was arrested by the police, and he was beaten by the apartheid security officers, and he was in a coma for 4 days. And again, just the story of someone who was there. You know, I asked my dad, where were you the day Biko died, you know? And he says he distinctly remembers the following morning, the headline of the Daily Dispatch. So the Daily Dispatch is a newspaper in the Eastern Cape. Back then, the editor was a Black conscious white man called Donald Woods. And the Daily Dispatch said, "Sikhahlela indoda yamadoda," which means today we honor a man amongst men. And that was the front page on that day. And it also helped me see why my dad, I mean, you can find anything in his house, you'll never not find today's Daily Dispatch. And I think he always really appreciated that editor, but the death, Biko's death was big. And he was one of the first big political funerals. You know, Biko's death really changed the importance and the power of political funerals. It was so big that they had to hire a stadium in King William's. There was no church, there was no space that could hold the people. And it was one of the first times that people really came in the thousands for a political death. And so, yeah, so that's just a little bit about Biko, and he was 30 years old at the time, just a few months away from his 31st year. And like I was saying, what's so powerful is just how much he did in that short time, how much he wrote, how much he shared, and how much he achieved in that time that he was alive. Yeah.
Beautiful. And I'm just thinking for the Americans, the connection to the Panthers and Carmichael. And just that a lot of ideas moved between Africa and the States, often via Europe. And we'll talk about that later. But a lot of I'm just thinking, you know, a lot of Biko's thought comes from these joint streams of liberation ideology that come from all over the world. And the energy to start changing things kind of starts happening when you look around and see in America there's action, in Europe there's action, in Mozambique.
Yeah, yeah. And I think the last other thing about Biko is, you know, when he came up with when Black consciousness came up, it was also a time where a lot of the other big political leaders were in prison, you know, so Sharpeville had just happened, Mandela was in jail, Sobukwe was in jail, the ANC was banned, the PAC was banned. So he also came kind of in a space where there was a vacuum of thought, a vacuum of solution, a vacuum of what do we do with being Black? You know, what do we do with being white? What do we do with all of this? And yeah, I think that's also was so powerful about those ideas and the timing of them.
Beautiful.
All right.
So a lot of our work comes from existential thinking, and I just quite like the idea of just positioning European existential thinking versus African or Black existential thinking. Because for me as a white person, seeing the difference between these schools of thinking really made Blackness a lot more understandable to me. So European existential thinkers tend to be, well, some are American, but European kind of thinkers tend to be white. There's a lot of men, and they seem to have a lot of focus on individualistic experiences around isolation, anxiety, death, and freedom. And because these factors are the most salient, the most easily noticed aspects of their existence. You know, remembering that existential thinking focuses on what are the factors of our existence. Well, for these particular authors, it was isolation, anxiety, death, and freedom. And what was really interesting when I started reading Afrikaner existential thinking, and here are just some of the authors, tracing them through from W.E. Du Bois, who the Americans might know, was that the most important aspect of existence for Black people in this school of thought, and in general, I don't know, I'm not Black, is the experience of being Black in an anti-Black world. So while white people focus on isolation, anxiety, death, freedom, Black people, the most important experience they have in the world is of being Black in a world where the world is anti-Black, you're negative, And there is a denial of Black humanity. There's this looming threat of being a non-human, of being a slave or an object, of being incomplete or deficient in some way. And so these are sort of within the existential philosophy schools, these are the two broad swathes of areas of interest. Would anybody like to comment? Who's tick-ticking somewhere? I can't see you. It's quite a profound thing, this, actually, that the most important existences in our lives are divided by race.
And you know, just while we're waiting, if anyone wants to comment, is the one thing that always stands out for me in this kind of looking at the two worlds is the individualistic versus the community and the collective activity, you know? And if you bring it into, even I was just reflecting on our opening when we were asking people, why are we here? I think that lens of being Black in this world versus the lens of isolation, anxiety, death already was coming out from the different people who offered. And I think the bigger thing is also this, looking at where we are today with COVID, you know, what are we trying to learn about collectivity? What are we trying to learn about community? What are those, you know, there's a lot of talk of let's come together, and what does that mean when we realize that we come from different positions, we come from different experiences? How do we then create a community?
I will just say in the US, you know, just I'm thinking about if you're I taught high school English, so I taught literature, and the US literature was always like, how can you be an individual within society? It was not about the collective. There was no conversation, and it was 90 to 100% white Americans writing, and then it was men, and you know, whatever. And so I was always teaching, how do you find yourself within society? That was like the goal. You know what I mean? It wasn't how do you see yourself as part of a bigger society. It was always, if there was British literature, it was always people struggling and then maybe stuffing it and then just being able to live within the society. And then you come to America and you make a change and you become a cowboy and you go out into manifest destiny, you plot your land. So it was that idea that individualistic was good. You know, that was what we were teaching. And then you had the conversation about anxiety, death, am I alone? It was just how I was a fish in water. I wasn't thinking about the collective. I was not thinking about white, Black as I was teaching that. And then I slowly did, but it's that orientation piece is heavy, heavy impact.
And as thank you for that, Jennifer. That's lovely that to bring that in, and your awareness growing as you teach that material over time. I just find this so incredibly profound, because for me as an existential philosopher or existential psychotherapist, what this is asking me is, how can I live in a world that denies my humanity? How can I be human in a world that denies my humanity, that wants me to be something else, that can never accept me? And that's why I love Biko, and that's why I find that Biko is, as a Black existentialist, he is the guy that gives us and all of us direction about how to be a human being in a world that denies our humanity. And that's we're gonna look at that as we kind of go on. I'm sorry, I'm just pushing time-wise. Chachamba, you cool?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Oh, yeah, sure.
Julia, if I hope you don't mind if I jump in very quickly. Just a very
Who's
quick
that?
question. This is
Where?
Lerato.
Lerato, hello.
Yes,
Hello.
hello.
The other one.
Yes. I was a bit hesitant to ask this question, and maybe I'll just leave it as a contribution to simmer in the background. I wonder how it would change the table if we introduced Black women thinkers on both in the kind of international sense and locally. Because I mean, I think about writers like Toni Morrison, Sylvia Wynter, Mary Oliver, so the Combahee Collective in America. I think of Charlotte Maxeke here in South Africa. And I wonder if we'd come to the same conclusion in terms of whether the central idea is about Blackness, and whether the idea of humanity might change.
I love that. I love that question because there's a name that I left off the list. Lerato, thank you. So, the question is, if you change the gender, would the conversation change? Is that the question, Lerato? So what is interesting is that the one name that I didn't talk a lot about there was Simone de Beauvoir. And she's the founder of women's liberation. And she actually was the guy, listen to me, that really noticed the gaze and how people look at you informs how you are in the world. And she was the person that said, you're not born a woman, you get socialized into being a woman. So you get trained to be a woman. You don't just get born in this kind of woman thing. And so she, to confirm your suspicion that if you change the gender, the conversation changes, she was the person that actually was focusing on the business of society forming us into something that was considered digestible by society. And she was, so her and Hannah Arendt were the two women. There were a couple of other here and there, but those are the ones that I've followed. So absolutely the conversation would change if they were women. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if you had mainly female, Black women and white women. What would happen to the conversation then? Because it's always such a tricky thing. And then sometimes in South Africa, the first step to employment equity is get a couple of white women in. So for me, I come from a little bit of a cynical base around that. And there's, when we talk about race, often the conversation gets slipped off into other forms of diversities. And one of them is gender. And it's like, race is just so incredibly painful for us to talk about. It's humiliating. And so we just slip off into gender.
Yeah, I mean, I think about how there are a number of Black women who write about, the table speaks to reclaiming Black humanity. But there are a number of writers who write about how living in a white supremacist world robs white people of their humanity, and what the path to freedom looks like there.
Yeah, when we objectify, we get objectified. Exactly, in the Biko thing. Yeah. Lovely. Thank you, Lerato.
Thanks for that, Lerato. That even just got me thinking of, other Black women in our time because I think you're also bringing in intersectionality, which becomes very interesting. What happens when you're Black and you're female and you're maybe gay and you're maybe Muslim and so there's so many layers, and one of my favorites is Pumla Dineo Qola. I think she's really working with some of those layering through the lens of being Black. So yeah, thank you for that. All right. So if we come to Black consciousness in particular, which is what Biko's ideology and theory that he develops, a little bit about that is, so Biko, you know, one of the people that also influenced or kind of walked with him in this journey of the thinking that he developed is a gentleman called Rick Turner that he meets at UKZN. Rick Turner had just returned from Paris, he had done a PhD on Sartre, you know, Jean-Paul Sartre, worked a bit in Cape Town, then he moves to UKZN, and at UKZN meets Biko. Biko's a medical student at the time. And through kind of that and Biko's own readings, you know, his work is also traceable back into the thinkings of Fanon, of Sartre, and for Jaspers. And Jaspers is a European thinker, but he's got that European lens of Ubuntu, or, you know, kind of humanity. He calls it humanity, but in an African context, we understand it as Ubuntu, and brings that in. So, and one of the notions that Julia was then mentioning is this idea of the gaze. So Simone de Beauvoir writes about it in her book, The Second Sex, and she's talking about, you know, you're not born a woman, you become a woman through the society you're in and the gaze of your society, the gaze of men, through your different experiences, you then become a woman. And then this idea is further kind of developed by Sartre through the look. And the look is, you know, how do you behave when you know that you're being watched? And the story of the keyhole. You think you're looking at someone, and when you're looking through peeping through the keyhole, you are the subject. And the moment you realize that the person on the other side can see that you're watching them, how do you behave? And suddenly you become the object, and suddenly you're filled with shame, and suddenly you know, if you've ever peeped, as soon as you realize the other person's looking at you, that's the look. That's how do you behave when you know you've been seen. And those ideas, so Sartre brings that, and then Fanon further develops this, and he really makes it very specific to the colonial gaze. He's a psychiatrist born in Martinique. He moves and lives in France for a while, and then he moves to Algeria. And whilst in Algeria, he really begins to see the impact of the colonial gaze, and he even takes us further to link the gaze to mental health. And he understands that colonization is one of the reasons that people have mental health problems, or this colonial gaze leads to real medical and mental health issues. So those are some of the, like, where these notions of the gaze come from. And then he also brings in objectification, this idea of being an object, having no more life. You know, he says in the quote, he says, the first, you know, it becomes more necessary to see the truth as it is. You realize that the only vehicle for change are these people who have lost their personality. This lost the personality, this empty shell, you know, and how do you make this Black man come back to himself? Is you pump him back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity and remind him of his complicity in the crime. So this empty shell state is that state of when you have now become the object, you know, through the system, and some of it also internalized. And so what Biko gives us is this two-pronged approach, or kind of this two-legged approach to what do we do through Black consciousness? What does Black consciousness give us? And Black consciousness has an outer approach and an inner approach. So the outer approach is this idea of self-help. There's the quote from Sasso, "Black man, you're on your own." Very popular quote within the Sasso community and today. And what that idea gives you, the self-help and the activism, it actually says stand up and do it. You know, so this is what Black community programs were in Biko's time. So it's the stand up and do it. You have to help yourself, outer world. And then the second concept it gives us is responsibility. You know, Biko really says we're each responsible for our own inner world, and therefore we're each responsible for our own inner freedom. And what does it mean when you are on that process? And so he also speaks about this inward looking process. That is the definition of Black consciousness. So that's how the two live together in how Biko gave them to us. Any questions or comments, or like we said, feel free, interject, ask questions, but yeah. And then Biko brings us to freedom and responsibility. So through Black consciousness, you know, Biko, the work of Sartre, maybe let me start it there. Sartre's work really talks about as men were condemned to freedom, as humans were condemned to freedom, and the weight of this freedom that you have to step into. But Biko quickly says that what we're all condemned to is responsibility, you know, and Biko is really saying that this loss of self-responsibility it's a survival tactic. You have to understand why you got there. You know, there's no shame in how you got there. There's a very particular system that you're living within. There's a very particular context that you're within, and it's a natural response to survive. You know, to end up being empty shells, to end up being dehumanized. But at the end of that, Biko says, at the end though, it's your responsibility to come back. It's your responsibility to find your inner freedom. And the responsibility comes first. You know, that's one thing that I think Biko always emphasizes in that process, is there's no freedom without the responsibility, because the radical freedom requires that radical responsibility from you as a human. Yeah. Okay.
How are you doing? Can I roll? Yes, Stuart. Hi.
Yes, I just wanted to comment in terms of the stimulation of my own thought right now. I'm of course thinking of Viktor Frankl and how he survived his imprisonment in the death camps, but I'm also thinking about how the notion of Black consciousness, how it could inform so many people in the world today about their own empowerment. Because as I think about this was a struggle for survival, as opposed to some of the white existentialist thinking, who were trying to make it in America, picking up on Jennifer's thinking. But if you think about some of the huge catastrophic challenges we're facing in the world today, you know, Biko's thinking about humanity is more important than freedom in some sense. The survival of our species is really at stake now, and people aren't getting it. And so the whole idea of a shift in inner consciousness, I think, is just critical. So I appreciate what you've said and how it has kind of informed and stimulated my own thinking today.
Thank you. That's beautiful.
And you know, just last comment on Biko's sense of freedom and responsibility. He even speaks of, if we don't pick up the responsibility, we will shortchange ourselves in the freedom. Whether you're Black, whether you're white, you know, he really emphasizes that part, that if we miss the responsibility part, the freedom will not be real. The freedom will not be true. We'll still be in same game, different face, different master, different, you know, nothing true will change. So thank you for that, Stuart. That's true. And that's where what we're looking at in our time. So many systems are in question. So it really does give us something.
Yeah, and just one more small piece that I think he's just so correct with, the whole notion that, you know, we've conquered outer space / the physical geography of the planet, but what's critical now is to conquer inner space. If we can't do that, we're all in a lot of big trouble.
Yeah. The most powerful tool, you know, in the hand of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed.
That's beautiful. And we're going to go on to some of the practical tools that Biko gave us. Sorry if I'm getting too pushy.
Oof, yeah, time is flying.
You know what I'm like. Yeah.
Penny, did you want to make okay? Did you change your mind? All right.
Oh, sorry, Penny. No, go ahead.
No, I was laughing at Julia's comment about being pushy and thinking of her as an Enneagram 8.
It's true. I'm all those things.
But I actually was thinking how I don't know if you all did this on purpose, but this is the anniversary of George Floyd's murder.
Yes, exactly.
And I'm thinking, I was watching yesterday, I guess, on the news, and watching how George Floyd's family is being held by other families who had murdered sons, and just watching them talk and talk about how they're holding one another in this madness, but they're also speaking out about it, which is a freedom I hadn't, and they're being televised to the US. So, and that's different. I'm sure that those conversations were always being had. I suspect, but now white people get to see them hold one another in this unique experience of having murdered sons. So that's what was going through my mind.
Thank you. No, it is a strange coincidence and a beautiful one. I'm going to just go through this and I'm going to hand it back to you, Chachamba, and then I'll wedge 2 slides together just for speediness sake.
Cool. All right. So then Biko also develops this idea of oppression, and he clearly points it out as oppression is outside objectification, physical oppression, and inner collusion. So outside objectification, this is where we really bring in the gaze. What's the impact of the gaze? But also the gaze is so layered. The gaze is in how history is remembered. The gaze is in what language are we able to use here today. The gaze is in what's beautiful, what's considered beautiful in our society. So, that outside objectification as well. Then the physical oppression, that being the systematic colonial framework system, apartheid system, which is very deliberate and very clear on its outcomes. And then inner collusion, and inner collusion is the idea of how do you also become coerced to participate in your own oppression. I think what's also always important to remember, what Biko is talking to, he's talking to a people who are coming from hundreds of years of oppression. So some of this oppression, even in today's world, living as a Black woman, it can be so tricky to try and figure out where, what, how, because memory sometimes is totally lost. Memory is gone. This has been happening for 400 or 500 years. Where do you start to fetch yourself in this context? But what Biko then goes into is that the introjection of this badness from this constant experience of this racist gaze, the objectification, as well as the dehumanization, then becomes the self-deception, or what Sartre calls bad faith, and bad faith being what you temporarily want to ignore to not disturb your peace, but what you don't understand is the long-term psychological impacts that thing will have on you. It's when you don't step into your own power. Biko even calls it that he's saying that you're drowning in your own misery, a slave, an ox, bearing the yoke of oppression with sheepish timidity. And I think that line of sheepish timidity is where he's really saying, what's your role in this? Where have you colluded with the system? And as Black people, where are we projecting goodness onto white people now, and really looking outside of ourselves for what's good and not inside of ourselves as a result of this oppression. So I've always appreciated how Biko breaks it down. Oppression doesn't come in one look and feel. It's so layered throughout society, throughout your community, but also within you. And this is where that inner freedom, that inner journey really comes into play. And he's saying, take off your yoke, ox, stop being sheepish, stop being timid, and step into yourself.
Any comments?
Yeah, just a quick one. How practical is this? Because I think even finding your true self, like you kind of need a coach maybe, or like a psychotherapist like you. So how about someone who lives in a township or even in a suburb? How practical is it to apply this stuff if you've got like trauma and all of this stuff that comes from race?
Good point.
Look, I don't think Biko never says it's easy, and I don't think it's easy. you know, in today's world also, is like you're saying, Alistair, how practical is it in today's world? And I think no one says it's easy, you know, and this is the yoke. What's your yoke that you're bearing in your context? Which is what I think Biko really awakens. What Biko's awakening in us is you're not entirely a victim of the system. There's a space, you know, that he opens up, that his work opens up within you to say, where's your agency within your space? And in terms of practicalityness, he made it quite practical in that time. He developed Black community programs. Biko lived in a time where being Black was being poor. You know, it's now where there's maybe different Black people within different economic statuses, but Biko lived, when you're Black, you're poor. When you're Black, you have nothing. When you're Black, the education system was deliberately against you. The health system was deliberately against you. Everything, you know, but it was practical. He set up, that's why he said, you're on your own. What does that mean? Do it. You know, what can you do? What can you do in your own community? What can you do in your own space? And that's what he did. And together also with these Black community programs, Biko also did a lot of work in educating people around Black consciousness, really educating the Black man around how is your mind being taken over? How is your mind in the hand of the oppressor? And why is it important for you to get your mind back to yourself? You know, so it wasn't just come play soccer, it was come play soccer and learn about your Black experience in your context. But I don't think it's easy, Alistair, and I'm keen to hear what you think, you know, if, is there practicalness to it?
I think it's very difficult.
The part you said about, you know, that he formed communities. I think that's a practical step where, you know, we can apply this work, because now I'm on a Zoom, I'm in my apartment, I've become more woke, quote unquote, but then if I don't share the message and also share experiences with other people, then the message goes to waste. So yeah, just highlights that I need to do more reading into his work and how he did apply it and then apply to the current situation. Yeah.
For me, a lot of Biko is a real no-brainer in some ways. It's the stuff we know, but we don't see. Like, for example, if you're alone, then it's useful to go and meet other people and to expand your identity. And I think that was the bit that really sold me on Biko, because a lot of what he says is incredibly practical and down to earth and cheap to deliver, but we don't think about it in the way that he does it. So it's kind of jumping the gun a little bit. Maybe I just talk about it a little bit later, but some of the practical ways that he suggests about expanding your identity, expanding your inner world, so that you can then go and do stuff outside.
Yeah. Julia, it's Tembi here.
Yes.
I share the same sentiment with Alistair. Yeah. So I think, and as the Chambo said, there's different levels of Black people and our exposure in how we interact in different spaces. So, and I'm thinking how practical it is for someone. So if you're in academia or if you're in a consulting or coaching space or you expose, it's easier. But I'm thinking of someone who's sitting somewhere and reading Biko's work and how they can apply the work practically while, if we take oppression, for example, while the person has the memory and history of oppression and still feels oppressed in different ways. Yeah. Probably by a different color now because it's a Black government and the survival of every day being in that space. So I'm not sure what I'm saying, but something, I share the same sentiments in terms of practicality of a person. And
I would like to answer this.
Sorry?
No, I'm interrupting, carry on.
Okay, so that's the first thing. But the second thing is that the the introjection and the projection. And for me, how I can understand it for myself in my experience is the introjection of badness and goodness, projection of goodness is if I can start seeing the whiteness in me, and if a white person can see the blackness in them. And I think that will be the start, because if black, for me, in my knowledge, in how I see and my experience, bad means black, good means white. So it means I have projected my goodness onto white. So the minute I can start seeing the whiteness in me, and the black person can, and the white person can see the blackness in them, in what they think their experience of blackness. And my experience, my stereotype of whiteness, if I can own of that, and vice versa. Yeah, something like that.
I would love to talk about this in the context of neoliberalism, in the hopes that we can take some insights from there. Would that be okay?
That's kind of coming up a little bit in the chat as well, Julia. So I think it's good.
Okay.
I just kind of also think, ooh, are we getting off the topic when we go into neoliberalism and making it more universal? But I don't know what's right. But
well,
you know.
I don't know what's right either. But I think the thing is that there is the possibility that we're moving away from blackness and black struggles towards wholeness into a more kind of a universal focus. And I suppose something related to my own whiteness is how I want to use Biko in my life. And so that's probably why I like this neoliberal piece. And I also think that when we stretch Biko out into the broader sphere and help him show how he actually is relevant to everybody, we offer it's the most amazing gift. And I don't want to move the conversation to a more global thing. We're going to go back to Biko now, in and out of neoliberalism and black, and in and out of blackness. So if you just indulge me a little bit, because although you can't really equate neoliberal capitalism with apartheid or blackness, there are some essential commonalities in the system. And I've just put some quotes here from various people about slavery in the neoliberal system. And Mbembe, who's an Afrikaner existential thinker, talking about the risks experienced by Black slaves are now the norm for all subaltern humanity. And Wilson talking about the disposability of people, in particular workers, disimagination, the removal of people's imaginative qualities, and the emptying out of their inner worlds in the very same way that apartheid did to Black people. And Dominique Heil, who uses the work of Heidegger, looking at humans as assets, as tools or objects. So in a way, the experience by Biko, the experience recorded by Biko, are not as severe, is now becoming a threat globally, that we all may experience this. And I don't know how you feel about this, because I'm getting a lot of awkward feelings because I'm the white person turning the subject to the white subject. But I want to finish this in the next slide, and then we can talk about it. And then I wanted to just bring in the work of Voss, because I just absolutely love his work. So Voss is an existential philosopher, and he looks at meaning, and he tracks the changing nature of meaning through the different centuries. And he says at the moment, we have meaning that is based on, that is materialist, hedonist, and self-orientated. So it's about what can I get for me and me alone? How can I stretch myself? And when we search for this kind of meaning, we're going to land up in very difficult places where people continue to be dehumanized, where we dehumanize ourselves and others, and where we risk the extension of the apartheid inner world around the globe. So anybody got some comments?
There's a wonderful comment Ingrid's given us on the chat. I don't know if she wants to share it a bit more or develop it.
Ingrid.
It's the link.
Hello, I'm on my phone. But yeah, I think that link is when, you know, when people are able to speak from a place that is in a very different relationship to the hegemony, to the kind of privileged participants within that hegemonic discourse, we start being able to see the truth of what it is, the violence of it. And I think it's, you know, women and Black people that are able to show that the status quo is not working for everybody. It's only working for a small minority of people. So I see this kind of consciousness. You can take the kind of principles of Black consciousness and broaden them, you know.
And use them to support everyone's liberation.
Yeah, exactly. For feminism to understand our own collusion in patriarchy, for us to understand our own collusion in the kind of violence of neoliberal capitalism, and to see that it doesn't have to be that way. So any kind of, I think any movement that makes space for other forms of awareness and critical awareness of the kind of discursive soup that we're swimming in, you know, expands our ability to think about our condition. I don't know, that's kind of what I was saying.
Beautiful.
Yeah. And you know, the thing about Biko also, thank you, Ingrid, for that, because Biko called it, you know, and I think this is why spreading his work is blowing my mind. Utsidi made a comment that he created awareness for Black people, not through therapy or coaching. And she feels the same is still relevant, 100%. You know, if we can spread Biko's work, how many more ideas can we be having? Not everyone has access to coaching, not everyone has access to these spaces, but Biko's work really calls it. You know, and one of the things he calls is, if we don't get this responsibility right, we're gonna get a half-cooked freedom. And he writes about the society we have today. He literally writes exactly what will happen. Few Black people will be let in. He writes it exactly the way it's happening. He writes about corruption, and he links it back to, if we don't really get this responsibility right, all of us, Black, white, we're gonna be served a half-cooked freedom. And that's gonna be another whole issue.
Yeah.
You know, I'm thinking about this from a developmental aspect, and, you know, how much work it takes to do that inner freedom work, and simultaneously need to be aware of bringing everyone forward, or at least creating the space for people to, you know, there's, in the US, we're so individualistic, I mean, culturally, that it's like, oh, I'm doing all this personal work. And I just feel like, especially in the US, that the collective, it needs to be both and, you know, the inner work individually and the collect, what can we do to bring everyone along?
Yeah. Well, so Biko offers a solution for both. If you think of kind of two inner worlds, the one in an individual and the other in a community. And in both instances, his solution is about expanding the number of identities that live inside the individual and inside the community. So if you're alone and on your own and you're just one identity, your ability to have agility in the world is very limited. And so if you join a church and you become a churchgoer, that's an extra identity, which is going to give you just that little bit more agility in the world. So you don't need coaches, and you don't necessarily need psychotherapists. But what is useful is curious people who want to experience the world and who want to go and find the other and bring the other in and appreciate the other. That's the important kind of compulsion. And how Biko spoke about it was that aspects of Blackness had been undermined and soddied and become something that Black people should discard. So he advised Black people to take those elements of identity and infuse them with pride. Don't discard them, don't deny them, but infuse them with pride and bring them back in. And when you look at this pattern, you know, in terms of neoliberalism, like if you are a highly idiosyncratic person, when you go to a corporate, you have to amputate elements of yourself in order to survive. You can't be, you know, there's this weirdness factor. If you have too much weirdness, you won't be accepted. And so you have to amputate part of yourself and leave it at the door. And in a way, I see Biko's work helping us in organizations to go back and reclaim parts of ourselves that we left at the door, that we denied, that we undermined, that could offer so much in terms of changing the world and creating a place where we all could live. So that's my sense of Biko. So that's on an individual level, but on a community level, it's the same. It's about getting in and understanding different communities, not trying to turn it into a soup where everyone gets mushed together, but rather holding difference within more like a salad, if we're going to go for the culinary references.
I love it.
So for me, that's why Biko, you don't necessarily need a psychologist. You need somebody to have a look at their history, find bits of their history that they're proud of, infuse them with pride, bring them in, and use those parts of their history to guide and direct their life now.
But how, and sorry, not but, how do we do that when the inner worlds and the outer worlds are shrink wrapped up in this maelstrom of neoliberalism that we don't even know exists, can't touch, feel, or engage with because it's so all pervasive? And identity comes through consumption now, these days. So that's the primary route to identity, I would suggest. It's arguable, but it's one of them, certainly. And so we're breathing in this air. And I love this philosophy and I love this work. And I just wonder, and maybe I'm just being helpless and a bit stupid, but how does it live? How can it be brought to life in a world that has that paradigm? I don't know the answer. We're not going to find it today, I don't think, but it's like a real frustration of mine that this beautiful work can sit within a system that will systematically oppress this work because it's not in the interests of the prevailing system. Sorry, soapbox has gone over there now.
I think, you know, like tiny acts of subversion, I guess. And collective act. I mean, like finding other like people who will participate in some collective acts of subversion. So I'm seeing that as well. And if it doesn't have to be one big, you know, movement, it can be many smaller movements moving toward the same objective. Is how I'm seeing it, because the big things don't tend to, you know, I say divide and conquer.
And I think there's also, you know, Biko speaks to, you know, thank you for that, Simon, because Biko really speaks to what do you do with the system that you have in front of you, you know, and he lived in the time of apartheid, but neoliberalism was still very active, and he had throw forward ideas for the future that we can see coming, you know, when the sanctions are over and South Africa is back in economic action. He had throw forwards for that. And And I mean, he had some really daring views. Biko was saying, we have to change the table. You know, Biko was saying, guys, the current table is really for white people. And as Black people, it's not even that we're saying, give us space at the table. We're saying, step back from the table. Let us remove from this table what's not African rooted. And then white people come back to the table. So if you put that lens on neoliberalism, and I don't say it lightly, you know, I also have to pay ESCOM and rates and whatever in this neoliberal world monthly. But I really think Biko challenges us to say, maybe sometimes the table has to change. Maybe there's things on the design of the table we're sitting at that don't work. And someone has to dare. So I think that's what that's also, you know, don't always feel, he challenges us to not always feel small in the greater system.
Self-alienation.
Oh, sure, time is eating us. So, and Julia, you touched on it a bit earlier, but Biko then says the impact of this oppression that comes in so many layers through the system, through introjection, through systematic oppression, is this thing called self-alienation, which is now the intrapsychic experience of that self-deception, of the self-evasion, of the flights from freedom and the judgment of other Black people. And what this then creates is these limited and negative and very small identities within ourselves. I want to quickly share a story, so I'm so conscious of time now, but my dad was telling me that in one of the talks that he went to where Biko was speaking at Forte in the 70s, Biko gives an example. And I think this example is how Biko speaks of self-alienation. He says, if you have a bottle of Amasi, sour milk, I don't know what Amasi will be if you're not South African, but sour milk or something of that sort. And it's sitting for a while. What begins to happen in that bottle on the inside is that the whey and the sour cream will begin to will separate. And when you try open that bottle to pour it out, you actually don't get nothing comes out because the sour cream has all moved to the top and it's actually blocking the bottleneck. And you actually get nothing out. And what you have to do is you have to close that bottle within itself and shake it up. And what that shaking up does is it's basically reintegrating the two. It's reintegrating that whey and that cream. And I really think Biko was speaking to self-alienation and building identities through that example. You know, he was really saying, Black people, go back into yourselves, go back and reintegrate what you've seen as bad, what the system has told you is bad, what the Blackness that you've been told is not beautiful. Black is beautiful is also a big Sasso term from the times and today. And this tendency to look outwards towards others, towards whites, today maybe towards those with money, towards just this tendency to look outwards and imitate and internalize is limiting you. And you're saying rather you need to look back inwards and build your worlds first and reintegrate parts of you that you've amputated or you've made to believe are bad. And then you can actually show up in the world as a fuller person. So that's where Biko starts to really give us some stuff with self-alienation and the impact of that.
And just really, my research is called Bewitched, Amputated and Dead. And it looks at how people go into corporates and the only way they can stay is by amputating part of themselves or becoming bewitched or becoming much like the living dead. And it's through disconnecting from self that one can actually stay in a corporate, well, in the corporates where my sample group went to in South Africa, that it was really difficult to be able to bring all of yourself in all of your capacity. And so what that results in finally is this absolute loss of agility and inability to respond to the world as it changes around you. As you reduce the number of identities inside yourself, you become like a one-trick pony and you can only do certain dances. And when the context changes and the music changes, you just don't know how to dance. And so people get stuck cause trouble in corporates, and we actually found a number of them committed various versions of fraud or other kind of dodgy activities as a way to punish the organizations for sticking them. But actually, it had more to do with the deal that they made with the organization on arrival. So that's Biko's work translated into corporates. The solution, and we've spoken a little bit about this, is the infusion of pride in all of one's identities. I don't know if you want to talk.
Yeah, so just Ashwin Desai has this beautiful phrase, flowering identities. And he's also linked, he was active during the Sasso times and he's a professor today. But really this rediscovery of the self, you know, and the infusion of pride in all your identities, the loving of the unlovable. And Biko says to pump back life into his empty shell, to infuse him with pride and dignity as one of the solutions. This shake yourself up, remix yourself up again, so that you can come out and flower and create more identities and more versions of yourself.
So that's the really practical thing. And that relates, of course, to expanded identity theory, which is what our assessment measures, is how many identities one can hold inside oneself. And this work is an integration of Biko's work with Cook-Reuter's constructive development theory and leadership maturity. And I'm wondering if we're not going to be able to do that, but I thought, if it's all right with you, Chachaba, we just take some learnings out for coaches.
Yeah, happy.
So for me, I think the most important thing is that most coaching is done in like an intrapsychic way. It's all about what's going on inside the person. And, you know, apartheid created Biko. So if we're not coaching contextually, we are coaching inappropriately. So we have to look at the context and we have to coach into the context. And at the same time, you know, that's about the outer freedom thing. At the same time, work, you know, in our inner context to develop a variety of identities. I think that as coaches, especially white coaches, we don't talk about race in our sessions, and we don't explore the impact of race on our clients, even if they're the same race or different race. And I think we have to actually just step up and start doing that and get used to messing it up and get used to trying to find dignity for whichever race one belongs to. There's a whole piece here about self and inner freedom and responsibility, as Chachamba said. We need to actually connect with ourselves and on the basis of that, take responsibility for our lives and our freedom. Something about understanding the neoliberal trade-offs in a neoliberal world. Something that I know Simon would find useful. And that is that, like, when you're coaching people from corporates, to try and understand that they make trade-offs. And what are those trade-offs? And will those trade-offs finally kill them? What are the trade-offs? How much of you, if you amputated, are you bewitched? Are you the living dead? What are you doing in that world? What have you traded? And how to actually revive the inner world of the person through supporting and growing their identities. And the process to do that is to find the discarded bits of self, infuse them with pride, and bring them back in and use them to direct their lives more fully.
Yeah. And I think my one comment, just to add on what you're saying, Julia, working with clients, is also remembering, depending on context, you know, and that context is number one for me, because that context also helps you as a coach to understand that person's journey to remembering, You know, depending on the color of your skin in this country, their availability of memory for you that's outside of yourself to build yourself with is more accessible to others and less accessible to other people. I like to use the example of just something small like a foundation. Just a foundation that you can buy, one foundation that matches your skin. You know, if it were not for Rihanna in 4 years ago, starting Fenty Beauty, really the beauty market didn't see a reason for Black foundations. So whenever I wanted to buy a foundation, I have to try and mix a couple of colors, and there's always a risk of a pot looking like a ghost and another pot fitting well, and you can never just find the color. And there's people who've never, for generations, have never had an issue finding a foundation color. And for me, I'm the first Black woman in my generation to be able to find a foundation color as of 4 years ago. So this is really where context and that, how far or when did the amputation happen? You know, the amputation can happen hundreds of decades ago. But I think also what's so beautiful, it gives us a lot of different ways to reimagine the future. You know, it shows us what's not. I mean, Rihanna saw it, and she's now got a very successful makeup business, and every single makeup brand is making Black, many different foundation colors. But if it were not for her to see the opportunity, who else would have grabbed it? So, yeah.
So thank you. We like to stick to time. Are there any comments that people want to make? Thanks, Krista. Penny. Any checkout comment?
Come back and continue. It felt too short. So book it in for another Tuesday. Please, both of you. It was beautiful dialogue and interplay and not enough time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Beautiful to see you here. Thank you for coming from around the world. Thank you, Narayan. Brilliant. Lerato, Solo. Thank you. I'm going to stop.